A Diverse Life, the podcast in which we explore life in all its diversity. Hello and welcome to A Diverse Life podcast number 7. Today we're going to be talking to a chap called Henry Field. Henry has recently been diagnosed with ADHD, that's Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, which is quite a mouthful. Henry wants to stress before we start the interview that he is not a medical expert in this. He is simply an expert in his own experiences and he's going to be sharing them with us and hopefully some ideas on how you manage this kind of diagnosis. So without further ado, it's over to Henry. Okay, so hi Henry, and thank you so much for coming on the show and talking to us about your experiences. Now, we know that there's a definition for ADHD, Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, but I think what we're really interested in hearing from you is what's your experience of that?
I suppose it's changed a lot through life. I mean, I only got a diagnosis about 8 months ago. So,
can I just ask as well for the listeners, if you don't mind, how old are you, Henry?
I'm 28.
Okay, right. So you've lived with that, presumably. I'm assuming ADHD works this way. You've lived with it for all of your life up until this moment 8 months ago.
Yeah, absolutely. And in school, I've always had the same feedback through life. So teachers have always moaned at the fact of me not really sort of paying attention or me sort of going off on tangents. Every employer I've had has made comments about, you're very good at your job, but for the love of God, just please sit at your desk. I've always been easily distracted. I've always had what I thought was an awful memory, but it wasn't necessarily my memory that was the issue. It was my concentration and actually taking in the information.
Okay.
It's something that's affected my entire life. It's just taken up until last year for me to actually find out or have a name for it as such.
Okay, and what was there a particular moment there where you suddenly went, I want to find out what I'm about? What was it that drove you to go somewhere and I guess you went to see a doctor or something? Is that how it worked?
Yeah. So over the last few years, I've been to the doctors a few times over the last few years, and I've always complained about issues with my memory. The first time it really was an issue was I was on Bluetooth in my car, and I was having a conversation, and I didn't realise that I was driving about 40 miles in the wrong direction to get home. It took me about an hour to realise that I wasn't actually driving anywhere near home, and I thought that it was my memory that was the issue. I thought that I'd forgotten where I lived. It was a very surreal moment, and that was the first time I went to the doctors. And
wow.
Then
that must have been quite a scary realisation.
It was. Yeah, it was an interesting one for me. It wasn't great. I started to sort of read into everything and get a little bit paranoid and worry about what was wrong with my memory.
What did friends say to you, Henry, when you say those sort of things to friends or people that know you well, who, I can listening to you, I can hear you're bubbly and interesting and probably quite a lot of fun to be with. And when you say to people, I'm worried about my memory or I'm worried about this, what did they say to you?
Not much. A lot of people just said just go to the doctors, find out what's happening. It's little things normally. The big things didn't happen often, like getting that lost and wondering where I was and sort of having to sat nav my way home. That happens not that often now, or at the time it didn't happen very often because I was living in an area that I knew very well. But right. Friends and family would sort of just always know that I had a habit of sort of repeating things a few times or needing to hear things a couple of times to sort of sink in. I've always been terrible with names.
Okay, right. So this was the main thing for you that you noticed was this thing that which you now realise isn't a memory issue, but at the time that was what highlighted it for you. So then you went to the doctors and you said, I'm worried about this memory thing. What was that, like an instant diagnosis, or did you have to go through a process?
Oh no. So
of course not.
The first one that took a lot more than that to get to this point. I mean, they went through everything. I went that one occasion was just sort of shrugged off as a one-off. They did some memory test when I was sat there, and they said that I was fine. So that was all sort of left as is with no real conclusion. A couple of things happened over the next couple of years, and again I went back, and I was always just told it's fine. It happens occasionally. The big thing for me was I moved to Wales. I'm originally from the southeast. And I think it got to a point in my career where I was taking on more responsibility. My roles were more involved. I was getting involved in things that took up more mental capacity, as well as volunteering in a job as well, for a local charity, and moving to a new area. All became a lot to deal with.
Right.
And my what I thought was my memory was getting so bad that if I took one wrong turn whilst walking around town, not even in a car, I'd have to sat nav my way, and actually you have a map on my phone to find my way back to the office I was working in, or my way back to the car. My Google Maps is full of little stars on where I've parked my car because of the sort of risk of losing it in the past. I've done that on several occasions.
My goodness, really? So you've kind of marked where you've left it, so in sort of apprehension that you might lose it, and you'll need to be able to find it again.
Yeah, exactly. So that's where it sort of really started to take a turn, was when I moved to Wales. It's always been an issue, but it got to a point where my career's been going in a very positive direction, but I was sort of coming up against a wall of my mental capacity as such is as much as it can cope with. So I was I went to the doctors, raised the concerns. I had MRIs, I had CT scans. They bounced around a couple of things on what they thought it was. At one point, they thought that I'd had some sort of blood clot on the brain. They didn't know if it was an aneurysm. Then I ended up with the Hamadryad Centre in Cardiff, and it took 6 months worth of mental health appointments for them to be able to diagnose ADHD, and that wasn't a quick process either.
When you say 6 months worth of appointments, are you talking one a week, or just?
It was every few weeks, but the stuff that happened in between those appointments were where the real time was kept. So they had an interview with my mum. They contacted my old school. They contacted a therapist that I had about 8 years ago. They spoke to a lot of people to paint a picture. They spoke to my partner. They spoke to a lot of people to paint a picture of what I'm like inside work, outside work, day to day, what I was like as a child, what I'm like now.
Yeah.
Because obviously the majority of people that do have a diagnosis, because it does sort of change as you get older, most people will get a diagnosis when they're children.
Right. Yes.
So to diagnose it as an adult is a lot more difficult, because a lot of the symptoms do sort of change slightly.
And it's funny because I think that it's one of those conditions that has that. People have that sense of it. I think if you said ADHD to people, they would probably say that's what they would picture is a kid in school not being able to follow the curriculum or something like that.
It's naughty child syndrome. It's what I've even now when I've mentioned it to people, I've had one or two people say I thought that was for kids. I thought that was just something they called kids that didn't behave in class. I called naughty child syndrome to me.
Yeah.
So I know that people do sort of normally recognise that as children because it's so difficult to diagnose in adults. It's not a quick decision to make, and a lot of time and effort goes into the work of the mental health professional that does that. Okay,
so what was it like working through that diagnosis process?
It was an interesting time when the diagnosis was very new, or when they were sort of trying to figure out whether or not it was definitely the case. I was given a medication quite similar to Ritalin. I take it 3 times a day, first thing in the morning, once at lunchtime, once at around 4 o'clock. And working and getting used to a new medication that really had some quite dramatic changes.
Can you tell us about those, please, Henry?
Yeah, it was. I don't know how to describe it. I've always been very quick to talk. I've always been very quick to talk over people, but I'm very aware. I'm very self-aware, so I knew I was talking over people. It's always something I've struggled to stop, and I've always had a habit of ranting, going off topic, and taking the medications. I found that quite literally, like the press of a button, I was able to stop, and I was able to listen to what was going on. I was here. It sounds really cheesy, but I was hearing things that I've not heard before. I was hearing detail in sort of noises outside, and I was at first, when I was getting used to it, I was getting quite fixated on things because I was seeing detail in things that I potentially skimmed over in the past because I've just not been paying attention. So it was really interesting to do that in the workplace, because I went from being very quick to respond, very quick to express opinions, to suddenly sitting back, hearing what's being said, and being able to make more informed decisions at the same time.
That sounds positive.
Absolutely, it was very positive in regards to that. It was being able to see those differences was very positive. I think the awful timing that's actually turned out to be quite a positive is that before the diagnosis, I also signed up and paid for my CIPD qualification. So at the same time as going through that diagnosis, I was a member of I was a student.
Right. So you were studying hard for something quite difficult.
Yeah, I was studying a level 5 qualification with the local college, with Gardenfell College. I was working full time. I was the volunteer manager for a local charity, all whilst dealing with this. But I found that time was a lot easier to be managed when I had when I was given that medication, and when I was going through that process and understanding more about what I've already sort of been half aware of and living with my entire life.
Okay. So you go through that diagnosis, and then someone says, "No, this is it. We're as sure as we can be, Henry, that we can say that you have ADHD." So how does that feel?
It completely knocked me back. I thought, going through the entire process, if they say it is, okay. If they say it's not, okay. I just want to be able to understand what coping mechanisms that I use myself are actually right, or what ones work and what ones don't, or what other options I can be looking at. And I thought that was going to be it. I'm quite clinical at times, and I really thought that was going to be the end of it. But as soon as I was given that diagnosis, and as soon as they confirmed that I have ADHD, I started replaying conversations in my head with candidates that I've represented in the past, because I come from an agency background in recruitment. I've only recently gone internal.
Yeah.
And from the agency perspective, I've quite often worked either supporting people with learning difficulties like autism or ADHD, or I have recruited for companies that need support workers to support people that are
okay.
living.
And so you were looking back on these conversations potentially with other people that also have ADHD, and what were your thoughts about that?
I was hearing the conversations from the clients' perspectives. All of the clients that I've had to have, I've had to educate about people with some form of learning difficulty or something along those lines. All those walls that I've sort of worked through my career and helped to break down for other people, suddenly, and it sounds quite dramatic, I know, but suddenly sort of built up around me myself. And I thought, well, it was easier for me to stand for someone else and support someone else than it would necessarily be for myself. And suddenly, and I never expected it, it really, really sort of hit me.
So is this like a little bit of feeling of isolation? You talk about walls around you and things. Is that the kind of feeling there?
It was. I wouldn't necessarily say isolation. I think when I say walls, I mean I've supported people that have been trying to get into work in the past that have had issues because they've got some sort of mental health difficulty or learning difficulty.
Yeah.
And employers completely wrongfully will say, this is going to cause issues. I'm not sure this is going to be the right environment. There's a lot going on here. It's not going to be a good place for them. So the walls are more like sort of those barriers. So I was ready and am ready in my career to be able to be taking that next step. But as soon as that diagnosis came, I felt like that was it. And that there's always going to be this wall that I'm sort of pushing up against to be able to progress.
Okay, and has that proved in any way true for you?
No, it hasn't at all. I very lucky. I've always, when I was working for a recruitment agency, I always put my relationships before anything else. And I've worked with some fantastic people and had some fantastic clients, some of which I was probably more honest with than I potentially should have been. And one of them asked me if I was interested in one of the positions they have available, or first of all, they sent it to me to work, and I thought I'd send my details over to them. I was like, yep, that sounds good. They asked me if I'd be interested. And I was completely honest with them at that point. I said, this is what's happening. This is the medication I take. This is the diagnosis. This is what it means. If you're, and I'm, again, I sort of over-explained it, and I really did overthink it. And I said, if you're okay with that, and you think that would be, you think I'd still be able to do the role, and they didn't bat an eyelid. They were absolutely, they've worked with me before. They know what my capabilities are.
Great. So that's a good story. They saw you. They didn't see the label.
Exactly. They've worked with me for a long time. They knew what I was like, regardless of what any diagnosis said. So I've used that sort of platform as such. It's probably not the right phrase, but in the workplace, because I now work in a HR department, I'm the resourcing and talent manager for a company in Cardiff. I now work closely with our HR business partner that focuses on equality and diversity. It's something that's very important to me, and it's something that I've always been passionate about. I mean, other than this diagnosis, I'm also I'm gay, so that's always been something that I've been up against in the past a long time ago. And it's always been something that I've been passionate about. So now I'm in a position where I can make a real difference, and I can be vocal about that. I have my medication out on my desk because it's better than sort of keeping it in my pocket and forgetting about it. I need that visual reminder.
Henry, it sounds like that we could have a whole other programme with you about the LGBT side of things. So there's loads to talk about there. But I guess just sort of coming back to the ADHD specifically a little bit. So I know that you're not a neuroscientist, and all of these things are very complicated. I've heard various things about ADHD, and I'm sure lots of listeners will have heard various things. One thing I've heard is that ADHD is fundamentally a group of symptoms, and if you have all of those symptoms and put them together in one go, you can kind of call it ADHD. But I don't know if that's true, or if you have a better way of explaining it as what that is to people.
I think that's pretty accurate. I always use an example. I saw that there's a charity in the area called the Autism Directory. I'm quite fond of them, and they shared a post about a year ago, and the post they shared said that you can be a little bit unwell in the morning. You can have sort of aches and pains. That doesn't mean that you're pregnant. You can have symptoms of pregnancy without being pregnant, and it's the same for ADHD. You can have symptoms of ADHD. You can have a short attention span. You can have a poor memory. You can have difficulty with time management and organisation. That doesn't mean that you've got ADHD.
But we can hear from you that this is clearly a thing, and whatever's happened, this medical approach that you've gone through, and you're taking these drugs now every day, and you sound very happy with the outcome of that.
Absolutely. It's complete. It's now got to a point. Now I'm used to the medication. It's got to a point where when I take them, I don't see the difference. But when I don't take them,
Right.
I don't sit. I'm so used to it now that I don't necessarily feel the difference or see the difference when I've taken them. Right. If I miss my lunchtime one, for example, I've got a sense of humour. If at work I start ranting at sort of 2:00 in the afternoon, or I start going off on a tangent, or I forget to breathe in between sentences,
yeah,
at my desk and think, oh, I missed my 12 o'clock.
Oh, I'm not having meds.
Yeah,
not having meds.
It's that time. And I will, and I don't have any issue making that sort of joke. I think with the only sort of issue I'd say with the medication is the side effects.
I was going to ask about that next,
Yeah.
so I'm glad you got onto it. Yeah.
So I've always had, and since being a young child, I've always had slight physical tics, whether it's my leg jittering, whether it's sort of rocking backwards and forwards when thinking. If I got overexcited playing a PlayStation game, I'd do this really weird sort of claw thing with my hand, and I'd sort of vibrate it under my nose, getting all overexcited because I was just about to kill something or whatever.
Yeah, okay.
I didn't know it was happening, but then when it was pointed out to me, it was always quite embarrassing, and I never understood why. And I thought it was something I'd grown out of. It wasn't until about, again, 2-3 years ago, someone pointed out that I'd done it, that I found out that I've actually always done it and no one's ever mentioned it to me.
Right, okay.
With this medication, it's a lot more obvious. So my arms will sort of jolt. I'll get
oh wow!
I'll get a twinge in my neck. It's a lot more physical.
So something about the ADHD. It's almost like the ADHD is going somewhere. It's going into your body a little bit, and you're kind of moving more than you used to.
It's interesting because it sort of almost comes out in like a physical form where I'm now sort of concentrating and being able to focus. If I get over stressed, over happy, over excited, over emotional, any sort of extreme emotion suddenly has like a physical connotation with it, and that can be in the wrong scenario. That's quite embarrassing. In normal everyday working life, it's, again, I've got a sense of humour. I know people can see it. I'm aware people can see it. There's no point getting embarrassed or hiding about it. Some sort of joke.
What we just need to finish on, really, because we've been talking for over 20 minutes, Henry, is really, what would you advise anyone who might be thinking or feeling that perhaps this is something that they've could be diagnosed with, or something that they're concerned about, or maybe not for themselves, but maybe for their child or someone they know or a loved one? What would be, I guess, your sort of top tips for them, really?
I think there's a few different angles depending on who I'm talking to. If it's yourself you're worried about, go see a GP, go see a professional, explain the symptoms that you believe that you have. Make sure you've got some sort of, examples that you can take with you, because, GPs are fantastic, but they need to sort of have that information to be able to make an informed decision or make a referral. If it's a parent that's worried about their child, I wouldn't be worried. I hate the fact that it's considered, I see why it's considered a disability, but if you are able to be self-aware, if you do enough sort of, what's the word? I've completely lost my train of thought. The
self-reflection.
Yeah.
Is that what you sort of think?
If you do enough research, you have a look at the different coping mechanisms, and there's a lot out there. It can be really silly little things, but if you've got coping mechanisms, it's not the end of the world. It's not the biggest issue. And I am purely talking about my own situation here, so I can't talk for everyone, but
of course, but I think it's really, I'm sure that people will be listening to that, and it's always lovely to hear somebody's personal experience, because we turn these things into monsters in our brains, don't we? And I'm sure for some people they really are having a hard time, and it sounds like you had a hard time through this process, but what I'm hearing is somebody at the end of that or coming out of that who's really benefiting.
Absolutely. Yeah. If the help's there, take it. That's the best advice I can give.
Brilliant. Okay, that's brilliant. Thank you very much, Henry. And I think we'll leave it there.
Oh, no problem at all. Thank you.
Thank you. Right, we just finished that call, or we just finished recording, and then, of course, Henry said to me, look, Ian, there's something really important we haven't covered. So I'm going to hand back over to Henry, who's going to tell you about some coping mechanisms.
I think, thank you for that. I just think it's important that, it's understood that it's not all about the medication. I know I mentioned that a few times, but of course I've had 28 years of living without the medication, living without the diagnosis, and I think it's important that people do just understand that there are other ways of dealing with that don't necessarily rely on that completely. So a couple of examples from me are when I'm on this college course, even though I'm surrounded by adults, when there are questions being asked in the classroom, I've put my hand up. And there have been occasions where I've had a couple of comments about the fact that I'm raising my hand. It's because of the fact that I know that I talk over people, and it's because I know that I have a habit of interrupting people that I raise my hand and then wait to be asked to speak rather than accidentally be rude to people. For time management, I've always got lists. I've always got lists for lists. I've always got reminders. I have reminders on my phone for all sorts of things. Alexa's an absolute godsend. It's just those extra little things that you can do just to make sure you're being self-aware as well, because as much as there are issues and there are big stigmas still related to ADHD, as I'm sure anyone that sort of works with it or has it themselves is aware, it's a lot to do with being able to manage it yourself as well, and making sure that you are making the effort to have those coping mechanisms.
That was really important stuff. And we also learned that Alexa is useful to some people.
I think it's fantastic.
Brilliant. Okay, I think we will definitely leave it there. Thank you very much, Henry.
No
Bye-bye.
worries, thank you.
Thanks for listening to A Diverse Life podcast number 7. And as ever, if you've got anything you want to share with us about the show, you can get in touch at adiverselife@gmail.com. Would you like to hear more from Henry? Because there is an extra version, Diverse Life 007 Extra, in which I narrate an article written by Henry. If you've liked this podcast and feel that other people should listen to it, then please do like it, share it, and if you've got the time, please leave us a review. It really helps with building our audience. And one last thing. In next week's programme, I'm going to be speaking to Saul Hewish from Rideout Arts for Rehabilitation about a prison programme that explores the history of prison food. Hopefully it won't be too gruelling. Sorry about that. Anyway, tune in next week. Goodbye. A Diverse Life is a workplace diversity solutions and Face Up Theatre co-production brought to you today by Ian Pringle. Thanks for listening.